Hello everyone, this is Angie at Chicken Scratch, and today I'm going to show you how to make this fat quarter basket using 2 fat quarters. Okay, so here's the fabric that we're using today. This is the front fabric, the lining fabric, and the fusible fleece. We're going to cut all 3 pieces to measure 14 inches by 20.5 inches. Okay, I've already pressed my fat quarters, and now I'm folding my front fabric in half. So folding it in half, and then I'm going to use a small ruler to clean up the edges. So this left edge here, here's the ruler I'm using, and I can see it's already straight. So now I'm ready to cut the front fabric. So here's my large ruler, and I'm going to cut this piece to measure 20.5 inches. Now don't look at the measurement on this ruler. You're going to see that I'm cutting at 21. I found later that I needed to cut it to measure 20.5. So again, remember, 20.5 is the real measurement. So now I'm going to open up this front fabric and turn it in the other direction. And this is the side that I'm going to cut at 14 inches. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to cut one side to make sure it's straight so that my fabric is straight. And here's that. Okay, so that's done. Now I'm going to flip this over, and then I'm going to cut it at 14 inches. So I just need to get the ruler again, and 14 inches. Okay, our front fabric is ready. So now we can move on to the lining fabric, and we're going to repeat the entire process. So I'm going to go ahead and show you that real quick. Okay, now that our lining fabric is done, we want to add our fusible fleece. So I'm going to use my lining fabric to cut the fusible fleece, and then we're going to trim the fusible fleece down by 1/2 inch on all 4 sides. So the first part of this is I'm just going to lay the lining fabric on top of the sticky side of the fusible fleece, and I'm just using this lining or the lining fabric as a guide to cut the fusible fleece. If you've ever bought fusible fleece on a bolt, you will know that it's not very straight. So it's a little bit of a challenge to get it straight. So I have found by using my lining fabric and then cutting it down, that gives me a more precise measurement. You might be wasting just a smidge, but to me it's worth it. So now you can see I've cut 1/2 inch off of all 4 sides, and now we're ready to press it. So here's my portable ironing board, and I'm just going to flip this over so that we can press the fusible fleece to the lining. So I'm going to get a spray bottle, and I'm going to spray this. If you're using the same fusible fleece that I'm using, you want to spray it with water. You also want to use a wool setting on your iron because you don't want it too hot, okay? So here's my iron. You can see it's on the wool setting. Now the instructions say to leave it in place for 10 seconds on the whole entire piece. So I'm going to fast forward that because 10 seconds is going to be a lot. Okay, now that our lining fabric is ready, the next step is fold it in half. I'm going to use some clips to clip all the corners and the side. I'm preparing it so that we can sew. So again, the corners, and then the left and the right. Now we're going back to the front fabric. So this is the front. I've got my label here. So I'm going to add the label, and I'm going to use a clip and a pin to make sure that it stays straight. So I'm just going to use one of these Wonder clips, hold that in place, and then I'm going to get a pin and pin it, and make sure that you place the pin where you're not going to sew over it because that would be bad for your sewing machine. Okay, so the same thing, we're going to fold this in half, and we're going to use our clips to clip the top, the bottom, and the 2 sides. So again, we're getting this ready to sew it. Okay, so everything is clipped. Now we're ready to sew it. So we're going to take both of these pieces, and we're going to stitch down the right side, and we're going to stitch down the left side on both of these pieces, the lining and the front. Okay, I'm using a Bernina sewing machine with a 1/4 inch seam. So I am using a 1/4 inch seam foot. Now that we've sewn the sides, we want to check and make sure that we caught the label. So that's the first step, is to take that pin out and confirm we caught the label. Now the next step is we want to box the corners. So for this size basket, we are using a different measurement than what we've done before. I'm going to be using 2 inches, which is going to make the bottom 4 inches. So I'm using the ruler and I'm lining it up with the seam, not the edge of the fabric, but the seam. So there's a seam on that right side, but not on the bottom. So I'm using my erasable marker and I'm marking 2 inches. And then I'm going to do the same thing in the other corner. So I'm going to do this on the front fabric and the lining fabric, and I'm going to fast forward the rest of it, okay? Now you're going to take your scissors and you're going to cut these sections out. So all 4 corners, well, 2 corners on the front fabric and 2 corners on the lining fabric, you're going to cut those corners out. For the next step, you're going to need your clips or pins. I prefer clips. I'm going to open this up. I'm going to bring this together and I'm going to use a clip to hold it together. For this piece here, I'm also going to use a pin just to keep that seam down. I don't always use a pin. So I'm going to repeat that process over here. I'm just going to clip it and then we're going to do the same thing on the front fabric. But on the front fabric, I want to make sure that my seams kind of line up, because the front of the fabric, of course, is the most important. That's the front of our basket. So you can see I've lined those up, and then now I'm going to bring these together and clip it. And then we're going to take it over to the sewing machine and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam across the top. And I'll show you that step in just a second. Okay, we're going to take this to the sewing machine, both of these, and sew straight across on both sides. And I'm using a 1/4 inch seam. So now we're ready to place the lining fabric inside the front fabric. So this is our front fabric. We want to take the lining fabric and turn it right sides out and place it inside the front fabric so that our right sides of fabric are facing each other. So again, I'm turning the lining fabric right sides out, making sure I'm getting those corners before I place it inside the front fabric. So I'm opening this up and placing it inside there, and I'm making sure that I align the seams together. And so we're going to be pinning or clipping this entire basket, but we're going to start with the 2 seams. I'm going to start with this seam first and then move over to the other side and clip that, and then I'll show you how to mark or how to leave an opening so that you can turn the bag right side out. So now that I've got the 2 sides clipped, I want to make sure that everything lines up really well. And the next step is we're going to mark where our opening is so that we can turn this bag right side out. So I've got a clip. This time I'm using a pin because this is where I'm going to start sewing. And then the other pin is where I'm going to stop sewing. I know it seems backwards, but you'll see when we get to the sewing machine. So now I can clip the rest of this to keep everything straight, because sometimes by the time I get to the sewing machine, I've shifted things around. So I tend to clip way more than's necessary. But if I had my sewing machine beside me, then maybe I wouldn't use as many clips, okay? Now we're ready to take this to the sewing machine and sew a 1/2 inch seam across the entire top of this, but we want to make sure that we leave an opening to turn our basket right side out. So I've got my starting pin and my stopping pin, and again, a 1/2 inch seam. Okay, so here is my starting pin, and that's where I'm going to start sewing. And again, I'm marking, or I'm showing you where my 1/2 inch seam is on this sewing machine. Even though I have a 1/4 inch seam foot on my Bernina, I'm using the guide on my sewing machine to sew at a 1/2 inch. I really prefer the 1/2 inch seam for the top of these baskets because when you turn them right side out to stitch the top, I've found it's really difficult if you only have a 1/4 inch to close the opening. So hopefully that makes sense. Now we're ready to turn the front fabric or the lining fabric, all of it, right sides out. So I'm just going to reach in here and turn it right sides out, and very gently. You don't want to rip your stitches out. So once I get all of this out, then I'm going to make sure that all my corners are out. So I'm just going to use my hands to make sure that I put those corners out. And then as soon as we get the corners done, we're going to put the lining fabric inside the front fabric. So I'm just going to fluff this up and then push that lining fabric inside the front fabric. And what we want to do now is get everything straight, because the next step is the final step, of course. Well, maybe not the final, because we do want to press it afterwards. But I'm just lining everything up, and I'm going to start on the seam on the sides. So I'm going to clip the first side, the first seam, and then I'm going to move over to the other side and clip it as well. And then we're going to find the opening and we're going to clip it. Okay, now that we've clipped both sides, we want to find that opening. So I've got the opening here, but I also see I have some threads. So go ahead and cut those threads. If you got any threads, go ahead and cut them. And then now I'm going to use clips to hold the opening closed. I am going to use a lot of clips because, like I said, taking this from the desk over to the sewing machine, things can shift. So I'm probably going to use 5 or 6 clips. Once I'm done clipping the opening, I'm going to go ahead and clip the rest of the basket. And then we're going to take it over to the sewing machine and we're going to sew across the top with a 1/4 inch seam. Okay, so everything is clipped and now we're just going to go sew straight across. Okay, so we're going to place this on the sewing machine and I'm going to line this up in the seam. So I'm going to start sewing in this seam. I need to remove this clip first. We are sewing with a 1/4 inch seam, but I'm going to also start sewing in this seam. And when I stop sewing, I'm going to stop right there in that same spot. So again, this is where the opening is. So I'm going a little bit slower here because I want to make sure that I get that opening closed. 1/4 inch seam around the entire bag or basket. Okay, our basket's all done. We want to make sure though that we close that opening. So I'm going to confirm that really quick before we move on. So yes, I did get it. Now we're going to fold down the tops. You don't have to do this step, but I think it looks really cute if you do. You also might want to give it a good press. It looks so much better when you press them. Okay, if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe and give me a thumbs up. Thanks so much. Have a great day.